We would like to send out a special thanks to Storyworth for supporting The Trail Went Cold. Storyworth is a meaningful gift you and your family can treasure forever, and you can get started right away. Go to storyworth.com/cold to get $10 off your first purchase. We would also like to send out a special thanks to Shudder for supporting this podcast. Shudder is the streaming service with the best selection of horror, thriller, and supernatural, from Hollywood favorites and cult classics to original series and new films. To try Shudder free for 30 days, go to shudder.com and use promo code COLD. Thank you, and enjoy the show. June 15th, 1994. Loxahatchee, Florida. 31-year-old Moses Lall and his 36-year-old aunt Lila Buerattan are discovered to be missing from the ranch, where they run a business breeding and selling exotic birds. They were last heard from 11 days earlier, and one of their employees, Harry Gobin, had reportedly shared a story about seeing them get abducted at gunpoint by two men. Investigators soon learned that Gobin was picked up by police in Georgia while driving Moses' van and using his driver's license, but he jumps bail and disappears before he can be questioned, and Moses and Lila are never found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be covering an odd missing persons case which has been featured on both Unsolved Mysteries and Disappeared. The 1994 disappearances of Moses Lall and Lila Buerattan. Lila was Moses' maternal aunt, and they both hailed from Guyana, where their family ran a business involving exotic birds. Moses and Lila decided to start their own business where they bred and sold their own exotic birds, and before they went missing, they lived on a ranch in Florida with hundreds of birds which had a combined value of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Since it would be a week and a half before their disappearances were investigated, over half the birds on their property wound up succumbing to neglect and starvation, and their family insisted that they never would have disappeared voluntarily and abandoned their birds like that. What made this case even more unusual is that another employee who worked on the ranch named Harry Gobin also disappeared alongside them, and he was briefly detained in another state while using Moses' identity. At the outset, there was ambiguity about whether Gobin was directly involved in Moses and Lila's disappearances, or if he ran off because he witnessed something which left him fearful of his own life. Whatever the case, even though investigators would later uncover evidence that Gobin was living elsewhere under a new name, they were never able to pick him up and question him, and his current whereabouts are unknown. Since there is no direct evidence of foul play, Gobin is technically not wanted for any crime, but it seems like the authorities have hit a crossroads where they need to track down one missing person in order to find out the truth about what happened to the two others. It's a pretty bizarre story, so we'll do our best to try and get to the bottom of what actually happened on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the disappearances of Moses Lall and Lila Buerattan. Our story begins in 1994 in Loxahatchee, Florida, an unincorporated community located in Palm Beach County, about 17 miles west of West Palm Beach. Our central figures are a 31-year-old Bagwanalya Lall, who goes by the name Moses, and his 36-year-old maternal aunt, Lila Buerattan, who goes by Lila. Moses and Lila both hail from the South American country of Guyana, where Moses was raised in the capital city of Georgetown in a family of 8 children. They both initially moved to Toronto, Ontario, Canada during the 1980s, where Moses had considered a career in modeling, but since the Lall family had their own successful business in Georgetown breeding and exporting birds and animals, Moses decided to follow in their footsteps and start his own. After he moved to Long Island, New York, Moses' parents helped him buy a warehouse in Queens to set up a business called Malabar Aviary Incorporated, where the Lall family would ship wild exotic birds from Guyana. After Moses kept them quarantined at the warehouse for 30 days, he would sell them to pet shops. Lila also decided to move to Long Island to help her nephew operate this business, and by all accounts, their lives were completely devoted to caring for their birds. By 1987, Malabar Aviary was receiving more birds than they could sell, so Moses and one of his brothers decided to set up a ranch for them in Broward County, Florida, as he believed the birds would benefit from the tropical climate. However, the ranch eventually wound up housing so many birds that the neighbors were constantly complaining about the noise and the stench, so Moses decided to relocate to Loxahatchee, as Palm Beach County was known to be a hotbed for breeders of exotic birds. In December of 1992, he leased a property on Velasquez Boulevard and transferred all of his birds onto a 5-acre ranch, and his Aunt Lila would join him there to help him operate the business. But around the same time period, the United States government enacted the Wild Bird Conservation Act of 1992, which instituted new federal restrictions and bans on the imports of exotic birds, so Moses and Lila would change their business model to breeding birds instead of importing them. Lila would function as the bird's primary caregiver, while Moses handled the business side of things, as he would often travel out of the country for weeks at a time in order to obtain new birds to breed and sell at the ranch. When they originally launched their business, Moses and Lila hired an employee named Daljit Gobin, a family acquaintance who also hailed from Guyana and went by the nickname Harry. During one of his business trips to Africa, Moses hired a second employee named Felix Roland Ayoum, who was the brother of one of Moses' business contacts there. Gobin and Ayoum both lived in the guest house on the property, though Moses mostly entrusted Gobin to run the ranch's daily operations. After the business was in operation for a year and a half, it was estimated that Moses and Lila were keeping nearly 800 exotic birds caged on their property, such as blue and gold and green-winged macaws, African gray parrots, yellow-nape Amazons, and toucans, and their combined value is believed to be approximately $700,000. Ironically enough, even though Moses was licensed to import birds, he had never actually acquired the proper permit to breed or sell them, even though it only would have cost him $25. However, since Moses and Lila were known for being very private people who kept their business affairs to themselves, they stayed under the radar and never captured the attention of the authorities. On June the 9th, Daryl Crew, a delivery man for a bird feed company called Tim's Bird Haven, made a seemingly routine trip to the ranch to deliver 30 bags of feed, but after driving his truck up to the locked gate and repeatedly honking the horn, no one showed up to greet him. Daryl noticed that some bags of feed from his previous delivery were still outside the gate, so he decided to climb over the fence and perform a search of the ranch, but he could not find any trace of Moses, Lila, or their 2 employees. He also noticed that the caged birds on the property sounded noisier than usual, as they appeared to be hungry. Since Moses and Lila were regular customers with Tim's Bird Haven, Daryl phoned the owner, Tim Tigrini, to inform him about the situation, and Tim told him that he could leave the bags of bird feed at the gate and return to collect payment at a later time. However, after being unable to reach Moses or Lila, Tim and some other acquaintances of theirs decided to call the Florida Game and Freshwater Fish Commission to express their concern that the birds at the ranch were being left unattended without food or water. However, since Moses and Lila were not registered bird breeders, the commission did not seem to take the situation seriously, and all attempts to involve the authorities were met with bureaucratic red tape. If someone attempted to call Palm Beach County Animal Care and Control, they were told they did not oversee exotic birds, but if anyone tried to contact the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, they were told to call Animal Control. Finally, on June the 15th, Daryl Crew went back to the ranch and discovered that the bags of feed he had left outside the gate 6 days earlier were still there. Daryl decided to climb over the fence to search the property, and not only was it still deserted, but many of the birds were now dead or dying inside their cages. After the Florida Game and Freshwater Fish Commission were notified about what was going on, they decided to perform their own search of the property. By this point, over 400 birds had died of starvation and dehydration, and those that were still alive had managed to survive by cannibalizing the dead birds and consuming water from puddles created by rainfall. A number of state wildlife officials, animal control officers, and veterinarians had to be brought to the ranch in order to save the dying birds by force-feeding them and injecting them with fluids. In total, just over 330 of them wound up surviving. Even though Moses and Lila were missing, they had left behind 3 cats, 4 dogs, and 3 tortoises who managed to avoid starvation by tearing into bags of monkey chow in the carport. However, an additional tortoise and 2 African ground squirrels did not survive, and a shallow grave was found on the property containing a box filled with animal carcasses which had been buried at a previous time. The Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office finally launched an official missing persons investigation and learned that one of Moses' vans, a white 1992 Plymouth Voyager, was also missing. While backtracking their movements, investigators learned that the last person who could confirm having seen Moses was a bird dealer who had visited the ranch on May the 29th to discuss buying some birds. 3 days later, this man spoke to Moses on the phone and heard him mention that he was planning to leave for Africa in the near future. The last confirmed sighting of Lila took place on June the 2nd, when she took a baby bird to a veterinarian in Deerfield Beach, but she never returned to pick it up or contacted them again. On June the 3rd, Moses made a phone call to Guyana and spoke to his mother, Mahade Lall, who went by the name Jean. According to Jean, Moses told her that he was tired as he had become sick with malaria after returning from a trip to Africa, but he was still planning to go back there to purchase some reptiles. Even though Jean never spoke with Lila, Moses told her that she was in the kitchen cooking. After the call ended, there would be no more confirmed contact from Moses or Lila, and over the course of the next 2 weeks, Jean would make repeated phone calls to the ranch, but no one ever answered them. It would later be discovered that the phone lines on the property had been cut, and there was no record of any outgoing calls being made from there after 9 a.m. on June the 4th. Even though investigators explored the possibility that Moses and Lila took off voluntarily, their family maintained that they never would have abandoned their birds and allowed them to starve to death. Investigators started hearing rumors that Moses had ties to international smuggling and organized crime, and may have been harmed because he borrowed money from the wrong people. However, Jean Lall insisted her son was not involved in anything illegal, and that if he was suffering from financial issues and needed money, he could always have just turned to his family. It was also not uncommon for legitimate bird breeders to receive offers from smugglers to sell illegal birds, so there was speculation that Moses could have been approached about this and found his life in danger when he turned their offer down. Apparently, Moses and Lila's long-term goal was to generate enough money from their business to return to Guyana within 5 years. Moses had recently started selling off and liquidating his inventory of birds, and was believed to have made around $80,000 in cash on the transactions. While Moses was known for keeping large amounts of cash at his ranch, none could be found after he disappeared. But there were no signs of any struggle or foul play on the property, and a search of the area failed to turn up Moses or Lila's remains. In addition, the ranch's 2 employees, Harry Gobin and Felix Roland Ayoum, had also vanished without explanation and could not be located. However, it turned out that on June the 9th, a bird breeder from Palm Beach County named Howard Voran received a phone call from a New York-based bird broker who said that a man from Africa had offered a friend of hers a number of exotic birds, and she wanted to know if there was a market for them. According to the broker, the African man said he got the birds from Moses Lall as payment for a deal that had fallen through, and he was selling them for about 1/3 of the market value. Well, Voran found the story to be suspicious, and after the missing persons investigation was launched, he shared this information with the authorities. Well, it turned out this African man was Felix Roland Ayoum, and after he was tracked down to New York, he spoke with investigators on June the 18th. According to Ayoum, Moses had been working on a plan with him to import reptiles from Africa, as he had hit a cash crunch and wanted to diversify and expand his business to include exotic reptiles such as tortoises. Ayoum stuck to his story that after one of these reptile deals fell through, Moses made it up to him by paying him in birds instead of money, but Ayum decided to quit his job at the ranch and move to New York. He maintained that he last spoke to Moses on June the 1st and was able to establish an alibi and prove he was already in New York before Moses and Lila went missing. While Ayum claimed to have no idea of Harry Gobin's current whereabouts, he said that Gobin had actually phoned him on June the 4th and shared a shocking story. Gobin reportedly told Ayum that when he arrived at the ranch that morning, he had witnessed two unidentified white men abducting Moses and Lila and forcing them into a white van at gunpoint. These men also stole several birds and put them into the van as well, before driving away. On the same day Ayum was questioned, a fisherman discovered around 100 dead Congo gray parrots, estimated to be worth around $500 each, in a field in western Palm Beach County. They wore bands identifying them as property of Malabar Aviary Incorporated, Moses' former business in Queens, but it's unclear how the birds wound up in the field or if this had any connection to the disappearances. Another surprising development took place when the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office ran a check on Moses' missing Plymouth Voyager van and discovered that it had been impounded 400 miles away in Richmond Hill, Georgia. On June the 6th, a state trooper had noticed a man changing a tire on this van on the shoulder of Interstate 95 and pulled over to check on him. When the state trooper asked the man for identification, he was handed a driver's license identifying him as Moses Lall, but it turned out the license had been suspended, so the man was arrested and taken into custody while the van was impounded. At the time, the van contained over a dozen Amazon parrots inside and about 100 exotic tortoises, as well as a videotape about how to change one's identity, which included instructions about how to acquire a fake birth certificate with official seals. When the man appeared in court, he told the judge that the birds and tortoises in his van would die if he couldn't care for them, so he was released on a $318 bond. The police drove the man to a local motel to spend the night and instructed him not to leave town, but when they returned to check on him the following morning, they discovered that the man had never even registered there, and he disappeared without making any attempt to reclaim his impounded van. The Richmond Hill Police Department sent this man's mugshot and fingerprints to the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, but it turned out this man was not actually Moses Lall, but Harry Gobin, who had been using Moses' identity. Unfortunately, since Gobin had been taken into custody over a week before Moses and Lila were reported missing, he was long gone by the time the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office found out about it. At the time, investigators were still unsure if Gobin was directly involved in Moses and Lila's disappearances, or if a story about witnessing their abductions was true, prompting him to hide out in fear of his life. Regardless, they wanted to bring in Gobin for questioning, but had no luck tracking him down. The surviving birds from the ranch would be housed by Palm Beach County Animal Care and Control for over a month, and while the Lall family hoped to purchase the birds themselves, they would have had to pay over $100,000 to cover the birds' care, and Moses also owed the U.S. Department of Agriculture $28,000 in delinquent import fees. Since the Lalls could not afford that amount, the birds would be auctioned off by the state of Florida. As far as Felix Roland Ayum, he would face separate legal troubles on his own in February of 1995 when he was arrested in Miami on animal smuggling charges after he attempted to conceal endangered tortoises from Tanzania in a crate containing other animals which were being imported legally. Ayum served time in prison for the offense, and while his current whereabouts are unknown, he is believed to have returned to Africa following his release. After learning more about Harry Gobin's background, investigators became more convinced he was responsible for what happened to Moses and Lila. On January the 23rd, 1993, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office had actually been dispatched to the ranch after a reported suicide attempt by Gobin, which allegedly occurred after he expressed romantic intentions towards Lila and she spurned his advances. While Gobin survived the attempt, another troubling incident took place in October of that year when Moses returned from Africa and discovered that $40,000 he had been keeping at the ranch to buy reptiles was missing. The money had been stolen by Gobin, who fled the area in one of Moses' vans, but Moses managed to track him down to Queens and contacted the New York Police Department to file theft charges. However, Gobin convinced Moses to drop the charges if he returned the money, and Moses even went so far as to give Gobin his job back and allow him to return to the ranch, as Moses still needed someone to assist Lila with the daily operations whenever he left on his lengthy business trips. After the case was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in January of 1996, the investigation came to a standstill, but it would be rejuvenated in 2011 when investigators learned from an FBI informant that Gobin was living in Jersey City, New Jersey under the name Roy Smith and had reportedly bragged over the years about having, quote-unquote, taken care of Moses and Lila. On March the 7th of that year, investigators showed up at his workplace in Jersey City to question him, but learned he had already left minutes earlier. Gobin/Smith never returned and could not be tracked down, but this new development led to the case being featured on an episode of Disappeared in January of 2013. Harry Gobin has never resurfaced, but he is believed to be living somewhere in the Philadelphia area, and if he is still alive today, he would be 65 years old. Until Gobin can be found, the full truth about what happened to Moses Lall and Lila Buerattan will continue to remain an unsolved mystery. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to take a moment to thank our newest sponsor, Storyworth. This holiday season, I want to give a gift to my loved ones that makes them feel special and unique, just like the relationship we share. That's why I'm giving Storyworth to everyone I care about. Storyworth is offering $10 off your first purchase at storyworth.com/cool. Storyworth is an online service that helps a loved one share stories through thought-provoking questions about their memories and personal thoughts. Every week, Storyworth emails a different story prompt, questions you never thought to ask, such as, what is one of the strangest things that has ever happened to you, and what's a small decision you made that ended up having a big impact on your life? Reading the weekly stories helps connect you with loved ones no matter how near or far you are. I mean, starting a true crime podcast about unsolved mysteries and cold cases was obviously a decision which wound up having a bigger impact on my life than I ever could have imagined, and has also caused a number of strange things to happen to me. Thanks to Storyworth, I actually learned from a family member who currently lives in Australia that they crossed paths with some people down under who were huge Trail Went Cold fans and were shocked to discover that they were related to yours truly. After 1 year, Storyworth will compile every story, including your photos, into a beautiful keepsake book that's shipped for free. You can order multiple copies for your siblings, children, or other relatives. As someone who lives several hours away from my nearest family members, I will definitely cherish my Storyworth book when it's completed and share it with whoever I can. With Storyworth, I am giving those I love most a thoughtful, personal gift from the heart and preserving their memories and stories for years to come. Go to storyworth.com/cold and save $10 on your first purchase. That's storyworth.com/cold to save $10 on your first purchase. And we would also like to send out a special thanks to Shudder, a streaming service with the best selection of horror, thriller, and supernatural movies, series, and originals from Hollywood favorites and cult classics to original series and critically acclaimed new genre films. You can stream all this great content ad-free for $5.99 per month or $56.99 per year. You'll have unlimited access to play their unique collection on all your favorite devices, such as iPhone, iPad, Apple TV, Xbox One, Amazon Fire TV, Google Chromecast, Roku, and Android devices. New supernatural terrors, edge-of-your-seat thrillers, and shocking horrors are added each week. Here are just a couple of the exclusives you'll find on Shudder. There's the found footage hit VHS 94, which is a Shudder original, the latest seasons of Creepshow and Slasher, new episodes of the drag competition show, the Boulet Brothers Dragula, the new docuseries Behind the Monsters, and this month will mark the release of a new killer shark movie called Great White and Prisoners of the Ghostland, a new film starring one of the Trail Went Cold's personal favorites, Nicolas Cage. Of course, given that last month was October, it goes without saying that I use Shudder a lot as part of my countdown to Halloween. I love Shudder's vast selection of content, as you will get a wide range of titles from different genres, from old classics to modern favorites, and an extensive library of international films. I recently rewatched an interesting vampire movie from their catalog I had never heard of before, titled The Addiction, which was made in 1995 by director Abel Ferrara of The Bad Lieutenant and Miss 45 fame. It stars Lily Taylor as a young woman who is bitten on the neck and develops an addiction to human blood, and none other than Christopher Walken plays the role of a vampire who is attempting to conquer this addiction. The great thing about Shudder is that even hardcore movie buffs like myself can uncover hidden gems like this which are completely new to me. So get started streaming on the best horror, thriller, and supernatural content. To try Shudder free for 30 days, go to shudder.com and use promo code COLD. That's SHUDDER.com with promo code COLD to try 30 days free. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of this episode. Okay, so I know that many true crime followers out there happen to be animal lovers and can sometimes react more strongly to the death of an animal than a person. I guess you could apply that same logic to birds, because over 400 of them wound up dying of starvation and dehydration as a result of Moses Lall and Lila Buerattan's disappearances. In fact, both the Unsolved Mysteries and Disappeared episodes show some pretty disturbing camcorder footage of the birds lying dead in their cages. Some of the people interviewed on the Disappeared episode acknowledged that during the early stages of the investigation, so much energy was focused on ensuring the survival of the birds who had not yet died, that finding out what happened to Moses and Lila did not seem to be the top priority. I mean, that isn't to say that there wasn't concern for them, but by all accounts, Moses and Lila were pretty antisocial people who would only interact with others for business reasons, and since there was no direct evidence of foul play, and Moses was known for disappearing for weeks at a time on business trips, it did not seem implausible that he could have just taken off. However, this was a very sharp contrast to Lila, because she rarely ever left the ranch, and her entire life was based around caring for those birds, and she pretty much preferred them to people. Moses and Lila's house had no furniture and only the most basic living necessities, but in spite of this isolated lifestyle, it sounds like as long as Lila had her birds, she was content. This is why the Lall family immediately suspected that foul play had taken place, because they felt there was no way Lila ever would have taken off and abandoned her birds and allowed them to starve to death. Of course, one of the biggest issues with missing persons cases involving reclusive, antisocial victims is that it can sometimes take a long time for anyone to even notice they're missing. The last date Moses or Lila were confirmed to be alive was June the 3rd, when Moses spoke to his mother on the phone, but it would not be until 6 days later when the delivery driver, Daryl Crew, noticed that both of them had vanished from their property, and another 6 days after that before the police finally became involved and launched an investigation. So who knows how much crucial evidence could have been lost or disposed of during that time period. Another issue is that Moses liked to do a lot of his business off the books without leaving any sort of paper trail. He reportedly kept large amounts of cash on his property, but none was found there after he disappeared, and if someone stole the money, how could anyone trace it or even confirm its existence? Since the Unsolved Mysteries and Disappeared episodes were made 17 years apart, it's kind of interesting to contrast their separate approaches to the story. Unsolved Mysteries went out of its way to paint Lila as a truly innocent victim who may have been killed for something she had nothing to do with, but they did come across as a bit victim-blamey towards Moses. Back then, the authorities seemed to be leaning towards the idea that Moses was involved in something illegal, which may have led to the murders of himself and his aunt, but the Disappeared episode tones that attitude down quite a bit. After all those years, it seems like investigators were unable to turn up any hard evidence that Moses was involved in something illegal or gotten himself into debt with criminal figures. Back in the 1990s, there was still some ambiguity about whether Daljit Harry Gobin was directly involved in the disappearances or just a scared witness who was hiding out in fear of his own life. But once it was confirmed that Gobin was still alive and living under a new identity in 2011, it seemed very likely that he was making a concerted effort to hide from the authorities. However, at the time of this recording, Gobin has technically never been charged with anything and is only wanted for questioning. It sounds like Moses did do a few things which weren't on the up and up, as he did not obtain the necessary permit to breed or sell exotic birds, and he still had a number of unpaid import fees at the time he went missing. But even though Moses and Lila weren't described as being particularly friendly, it does sound like they ran an honest business and always deliver what their customers paid for. We do have a third-hand account from Felix Roland Eum that Moses and Lila were abducted at gunpoint by two men, but since this was supposedly shared by Harry Gobin, who is suspected of potentially causing the disappearances himself, we have no idea if this story is even true. If anything, Moses' biggest flaw might be that he was too trusting of Gobin, especially since Gobin had caused him problems in the past. So here's what we know about the timeline. The last time Moses and Lila were confirmed to be alive was when Moses spoke to his mother on the phone on June the 3rd. According to phone records, the final outgoing call from the ranch took place at 9 a.m. on June the 4th, which is the same date when Gobin said he saw Moses and Lila get abducted, and the ranch's phone lines were cut sometime after that. Even though no one really noticed they were missing until June the 9th, Gobin was caught using Moses' van and driver's license in Georgia on the 6th, so something obviously happened to Moses and Lila before that. As for Felix Roland Eum, we know that he was attempting to sell some of Moses' birds on the 9th, but he maintained that Moses gave them to him as compensation for a deal which fell through. Eum also claimed that he quit his job at the ranch and moved to New York before the disappearances took place, and while details are sketchy, it does sound like Eum's story was corroborated. However, even if Eum was not directly involved in what happened to Moses and Lila, you do have to wonder if he might have known more than he was letting on. After all, he said that Gobin phoned him on June the 4th to share his story about witnessing the abductions, yet it doesn't sound like Eum was concerned enough about their well-being to take the initiative to contact the authorities. He only told investigators about this alleged abduction when they tracked him down 2 weeks later. And Eum later found himself in legal trouble when he was arrested and sent to prison on animal smuggling charges the following year, so he was obviously a fairly shady character in his own right. However, even though Eum supposedly returned to Africa and his current whereabouts are unknown, it does not sound like the authorities are actively searching for him like they are for Gobin, so I get the sense that they do not consider him to be a suspect. Now, if Gobin's story about witnessing an abduction is true, it's very odd that he would phone Eum, a guy who was living in New York and powerless to do anything about the situation, instead of contacting the authorities. After all, Gobin supposedly made a failed suicide attempt a year and a half later because Lila resisted his advances, so you'd think he would care if her life was in danger. Even if Gobin was in fear for his own life, why not at least make one anonymous call to the police from a payphone to report a kidnapping? It really does come across that Gobin intentionally called Eum to plant the seeds for a false abduction story in order to divert suspicion away from himself. Also, it's one thing to flee the state because you have witnessed a crime and are terrified, but it's another to take your boss's van and driver's license and pretend to be him when you're approached by the police, which is exactly what Gobin did. Not to mention the fact that when the van was impounded, it contained over a dozen Amazon parrots and 100 tortoises. It seems odd that someone so fearful about his own life would go to the trouble of loading all those birds and animals into the van before he took off. When Gobin shared his abduction story, he specifically mentioned Moses and Lila being forced into a white van by two men who also stole some birds at the same time. Gobin was later found driving a white van with stolen birds inside, so it's almost like he was sharing a fabricated story with elements of truth, except he was painting himself as an innocent witness rather than the abductor. It's also quite interesting that Moses' van had a videotape containing instructions about how to change one's identity. While it was never conclusively established if the video belonged to Moses or Gobin, Gobin did apparently change his identity since he was found to be living under the name Roy Smith many years later. I think Gobin just ran into some bad luck because he had no idea that Moses' driver's license had been suspended. If it wasn't for that, Gobin never would have been taken into custody by the Richmond Hill Police Department, and his mugshot and fingerprints wouldn't have ended up on the record. If this did not take place, Moses' van may never have been found, there would not be any concrete proof that Gobin attempted identity theft, and investigators might view this case in an entirely different light today. So if Gobin was the guilty party, he would have had around 2 or 3 days to dispose of Moses and Lila's bodies and other potential evidence before he traveled to Georgia, so theoretically, their remains could be anywhere. But of course there's a question of motive. The exotic bird industry can be a pretty competitive business with a lot of transactions taking place off the books, and if someone decided to steal some birds from Moses and Lila, they were kind of left in a precarious situation. Since they technically did not have a permit to breed and sell exotic birds, reporting something like this to the authorities could potentially bring about their own legal troubles. One detail about this case which took many people by surprise is that some of the most expensive birds that they kept on their property, which were worth thousands of dollars, wound up being left behind to succumb to starvation. This is the biggest hole in the theory about the disappearances being financially motivated or Moses owing money to some criminal figures, as his birds were his greatest asset, yet no one bothered to take them. Yes, stealing some birds while in the midst of abducting and murdering two people and disposing of their bodies is not an easy task, but why not return to the ranch to get the birds after the job is done? Remember, it was in a pretty remote place and could be easily accessed by simply hopping the fence. Since it was days before anyone even noticed that Moses and Lila were missing, there would have been ample time to remove the most valuable birds from the property rather than letting them waste away and die. If Gobin was the sole perpetrator, it seems odd that he would just steal some Amazon parrots and a bunch of tortoises, which were not even close to being the most valuable assets at the ranch, but he may not have had the necessary connections to sell them anyway. One strange detail about this case which has never been satisfactorily explained was the discovery of around 100 dead Congo gray birds in a field in Palm Beach County. Since they had bans identifying them as the property of Malabar Aviary Incorporated, Moses' former business in Queens, they had obviously belonged to Moses at some point, but he hadn't worked there in years. Did he originally import these birds into New York and then transport them to Florida? Did Gobin or someone else originally steal these birds from the ranch? If so, why did they just dump them into a field instead of selling them? Did they become paranoid because they feared the identification bans would trace any sales back to Moses? Of course, since Moses supposedly had large quantities of money lying around on his property, that could have been the primary motive for killing him, and the potentially valuable birds were secondary. After all, Moses had recently started liquidating his inventory and possibly made as much as $80,000, so he could have had a lot of cash in his possession at that time. The thing with Harry Gobin is that he had already attempted to steal $40,000 in cash from Moses 8 months earlier, and remarkably, not only did Moses decline to press charges, but he actually allowed Gobin to have his old job back at the ranch. That paints Moses as an incredibly forgiving, albeit naive, person, but he may have just done this out of necessity because he desperately needed someone else to help Lila take care of the ranch while he was away on business trips. It's not entirely clear to me when Felix Roland Eum was originally hired to work at the ranch, but perhaps Moses decided to bring in a second employee to keep Gobin on a tighter leash. I find it to be interesting timing that Moses and Lila went missing a short time after Eum quit his job and left the state. Theoretically, if Gobin wanted to steal money again, he might have wanted to wait until there was one less person working and living at the ranch who could stop him. And since Gobin was tracked down and caught the last time he attempted to steal from Moses, perhaps he felt that the only way to get away with it this time around was to commit murder. Of course, this is all just speculation, as it's never been officially confirmed that there was a large stash of money on the property at the time Moses went missing. After having $40,000 in cash stolen from you, it does seem pretty foolhardy that Moses would not keep it in a safer place, particularly when he's allowing the same guy who originally stole from him to live on his property again. Also, the one reason I'm a bit skeptical about this theory is that Gobin was not carrying any large quantities of cash inside Moses' van when it was impounded in Georgia. If Gobin stole a bunch of money from Moses, what did he do with it? Did he stash it somewhere? Part of me wonders if the motive for this crime might have been personal rather than financial. After all, Gobin seemed to have a thing for Lila, and apparently went so far as to attempt suicide when she rejected him over 1 year earlier. When you combine that incident with the $40,000 theft, it's just remarkable that Moses and Lila would continue living and working with this guy, but if he still had feelings for Lila, perhaps Gobin just reached his breaking point when she turned him down again, and he responded by killing both her and her nephew and disposing of their bodies. Whatever happened, Gobin did manage to successfully disappear for a while and start a new life under the name Roy Smith, and considering that the authorities missed finding him at his workplace by mere minutes, you can understand why the case was rejuvenated and featured on an all-new episode of Disappeared. But sadly, it's been nearly 9 years since that episode originally aired, and I have heard absolutely nothing about any new progress at finding Gobin. The problem is that Roy Smith is a pretty common, generic name, and who knows if Gobin is even using that identity anymore. The only existing photographs of Gobin are over 27 years old, and it sounds like he might look different today, as those who interacted with him said he put on quite a bit of weight. Given the circumstances, I'm surprised that no age-enhanced photographs have ever been released for him. If by chance, Gobin truly was an innocent victim who went into hiding after witnessing Moses and Lila's abduction, I see no reason why he would not come forward after all this time, as he really shouldn't have anything to fear after all these years. The most likely theory is that Gobin was responsible for what happened, but without the victims' bodies or any other hard evidence of foul play, it seems unlikely that a case can be made against him unless he is tracked down and questioned. This definitely seems like a story involving 3 missing persons, where 2 of them may never be found unless the third one provides some answers. So if you happen to have any information on the unsolved disappearances of Moses Lall and Lila Buerattan, or the whereabouts of Daljit Harry Gobin, please contact the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office at 561-688-3000. That's 561-688-3000. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Since last month was October, we decided to release a Halloween-themed episode about the infamous Cash Landrum UFO incident, where 2 women and a child supposedly had an encounter with a UFO on a remote road in Texas one night and may have wound up being exposed to radiation, which gave them serious illnesses. I'm also going to be dropping the occasional exclusive bonus Patreon episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, and we recently released an episode in which myself and my co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, discuss the unsolved murder of Todd McAfee. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Darla M., Deborah W., William S., Sarah, Sam P., and Steve E. Thank you all so much for your support. I'm also pleased to announce that The Trail Went Cold has been added to the lineup for Podcast Row at CrimeCon 2022, which is being held in Las Vegas from April the 29th until May the 1st. If you would like to purchase tickets, we already have our own personalized promo code to get a discount. So to receive a 10% discount off a standard badge, please visit crimecon.com and enter the promo code TRAIL. Once again, that's crimecon.com and the promo code is TRAIL. In addition, I wanted to provide another reminder that I hold live streaming sessions on a platform called Get Vocal. Every Thursday night from 7 until 8 p.m. Eastern Time, I host what is essentially an after show for each week's podcast episode, where I have an interactive discussion about the featured case from said episode and answer questions and address comments from listeners. I always include a link to these sessions in our show notes, so be sure to check there for more information, or visit getvocal.com. That's GETVOKL.com. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the ear music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.